Unintentional injuries, such as those resulting from falls, fires, or transportation related deaths, are a harsh reminder for how important public safety can be. More than 12,000 children under the age of 18 die each year in such accidents. These tragedies raise interesting questions. How can we change people's behavior to help them be more safe? Or how can we design better gadgets that enhance child safety? We all know that using your phone while driving or driving above a certain speed limit is dangerous. Yet, more than 350,000 crashes result from distracted and reckless driving each year. Often, simple solutions can be dramatically transformative. But these seemingly straightforward ideas can also be extremely hard to implement. Hi everyone, and welcome to Doc Talk. Today, I have the pleasure of discussing one of the most under-recognized public health problems with a leading expert on traffic injuries. Please welcome my guest at this time, a fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the scientific director at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia's Center for Injury Research and Prevention, and a professor of pediatrics at Penn, Flaura Winston. Dr. Winston, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's great to be here.
So, could you tell us about some of the current work that you do and how did you get interested in traffic injuries?
Well, at the core of what I'm interested in is to reduce suffering and to help children to grow up to reach their full potential. It doesn't really matter in what way things go awry, but in the end, when things happen with children that affect their early life, their development, their growth, it can lead to a lifetime of disability and lead a lifetime of not reaching their full potential. So very early on, I discovered that one of, as you said, the least recognized causes of disruption are injuries, and in particular traffic injuries. I think people might be surprised to know that, for example, for adolescents, the number one cause of death is motor vehicle crashes, and it accounts for 1/3 of the deaths for 14 to 17-year-olds. It's not cancer, it's not flu, it's motor vehicle crashes. And so when I really looked at this, and I really could have studied anything, I said, you know what? This is not studied well. It deserves the science that it needs. Children are not young adults, and they need the rigor that we put into all other clinical problems in order to find solutions.
That is just mind-boggling. Now, what you're doing right now seems quite different than what you would have done, say, for your PhD work. So, was there an organic shift, or did you one day just realize that, this is a huge problem and just shifted gears altogether?
For my PhD, I didn't learn a skill. I learned how to think. And I had a terrific advisor who really challenged the norms. That was just what he did. And so while my PhD was very basic science, I invented a system to stretch cells in culture. I was exposed to a way of thinking that really got at the core of what is the problem. And when you really define a problem of a massive scale, then you start coming up with a research agenda that may take you out of your initial discipline. It might be that I'm doing engineering, and I did plenty of engineering, but it might be that I'm doing behavior. It might be that I'm doing economics, because really you want to have the right method and the right tool to solve the right problem. And you want to ask a very good question. And that's research. Research is about asking a good question, and then scholarly research is to systematically answer that. And it's not about, I am an engineer, so every answer is going to be engineering. It's not that I'm a biochemist, so every answer has to be biochemistry, or genetics, every answer is genetics. It's what is the problem and what tools do I bring to bear to solve that problem?
So, when you go about solving these problems or investigating these systems, you bring together teams that have expertise ranging from economics, like you said, to say engineering or basic cell biology. So, how do you keep all these teams together?
When I think about it, I also don't think about it very simply to say, oh, I'm going to improve car seats or airbags or traumatic stress. It's the idea, it's this continuum, that if we really keep our eye on the charge of pediatrics, which is to help every child grow up to reach their full potential. That's really what the charge of pediatrics is. Then you have to think about going backwards. What are the paths you do? And it's led to an area that I'm talking about more now, which I call precision health, which is the right intervention for the right patient at the right time in the right place. Okay? So for a child, if you ultimately want to make sure they reach their full potential and that traffic injury does not get in the way, then where do you start? You start by preventing the car crash. And then if that doesn't work, because things will happen, then you make sure that their injuries are as minor as possible given the car crash, right? Then if that happens and they still get injured, then you make sure that their resuscitation is good. You make sure that you've dealt with not only their physical injuries, but their psychosocial injuries, and that you then help them reach their full potential from their new normal, right? So it's evolving over time, this concept of what does my patient need today? And then making sure that we have evidence-based tools at our ready to help that family and that patient.
That sounds amazing. Now, I would also imagine that a lot of people out there probably don't see traffic injuries as being a big health concern. So, when such a skeptical parent comes to your clinic who does not believe in statistics and who is not convinced that traffic injuries or other accidental injuries are indeed a huge problem, how do you convince such a patient?
I think that it's a lot of the doctors who don't realize that it's important. That's really what the issue is. The families understand the risks that their children are facing. Sometimes as they get older, they might downplay the risks, but once you really describe it to them, they want to do the best for their child, right? And so it's about meeting them where they need to be. So I'm a primary care pediatrician, and I love being that. And really what the whole part is, it's an alliance. It's something where you're with them all holistically throughout the child's from birth all the way through till when they go off to adult medicine. And it's about understanding where the solutions fit within their life, right? So I wouldn't say, oh, never drive, because some children, in order to achieve their full potential, have to drive. But let's do it safely. So let's gradually increase your driving privileges until you've demonstrated maturity and skill and experience, and then go on. So that's sort of a solution, I would say, to a family. It makes total sense, right? It's not about information. That's necessary but insufficient. It's about the getting it into their world so that you understand it. We talk a lot about user-centered design when you talk about technology, but in medicine we think that just if you give information to someone, that's good enough. It's not. You have to give your information in the context that families can live with it. Families have taught me over the years. They're my greatest educators are actually the children and their parents.
Well, I think that's really humble of you to say. Now, ma'am, when you came to Penn as an undergrad, which was 33 years ago, you stayed on for the MD PhD program and stayed on for residency, stayed on now as a faculty. So what is it that has made you stay on and not go to a different place? And what do you think are some of the advantages and disadvantages of staying at one place and not moving elsewhere?
Staying here, it's all about Benjamin Franklin, let's be clear, right? My blood runs red and blue. I started here in 79, and from the day I came into this institution, there was never an obstacle. You could do whatever you wanted. Whatever you wanted. I mean, I was fortunate. Some of the people I got to be with and work with just never ceased to amaze me in the opportunities that were available. If you were somebody who had a good idea, could run a team, you could do it. So why do I have to go to another city? Philadelphia's a wonderful city. I think that the reality is, am I still making progress? So it's not as much about where I am, because I'll be honest, I have this incredible collaboration with an Israeli film producer in Israel. We're doing work actually coming up with the World Bank. And, I have a relationship with somebody in Ireland, and we work together at the ends of the life spectrum. He's older drivers, I'm the younger drivers. I mean, the boundaries don't exist. I think in this day and age of the internet, I don't think place matters anymore. I think it's about, again, good problems and good communication and building teams that bring together the best people to solve a problem. There's Zoom and Skype and Trello and all the different ways that we can all work together. And I think that the idea that you have to be in a certain place to accomplish something doesn't make sense anymore.
So continuing along those lines, when you started thinking about applying to an MD PhD program, were factors like length of training or having a family or academic biases ever things that crossed your mind?
I always knew I wanted to be a doctor. That's never been a question. That was always there. And I discovered engineering, and I thought, wow, this is a great combination. Engineering, medicine, that's a great combination. So many people thought I was nuts. My whole life, there have been lots of people who were like, I don't know what she's doing, but I guess it's okay. And they let me do it. But I don't need them to tell me what I'm doing is right or wrong. If I know in my heart that, again, my mission is right, and that I'm doing rigorous work, and that I'm bringing together the right people, and then most importantly, that I'm affecting change. And I can say that in my life, I've been really fortunate that not only did I discover things, and not only did I set up surveillance systems, but I've actually changed things and saved lives. And that's what more could you want to do? So, no, I've never questioned my career.
There's clearly some sort of bias that exists in academia that hampers, say, tenured female physician scientists. So, was there ever, or has there ever been a moment when you've faced a particular challenge that you'd like to share with our viewers just based on the fact that you are a woman?
I think there's the one is biologic in that I have two children, so I was pregnant. But I have to say that you have to be good at what you do. And if you're good and you're diligent and you get what you need to get done, then the next step is you have to know that family comes first. And it did for me. It always did. My number one job was being a mother. And so I asked for what I needed so that I could balance my life. And in fact, I did a part time residency at CHOP. And to this day, Dick Johnston, who was then physician in chief at CHOP, said that it was one of his best accomplishments. He was so happy that he did that for me. And just recently, we were together at a dinner, and I was with his wife, and it was just lovely. But I just went to him and I said, look, I love CHOP. I want to be at the Children's Hospital Philadelphia. I want to be a resident here. But I have a 1.5-year-old, and there's no way that I'm going to take call every third, and then it was every third night, and not see my child in his earliest ages. And so, can I do a part-time residency? And we worked it out. We just did. We just made it happen, and it didn't hurt anybody. And I did way more in neonatology than I ever really wanted to do, because that's what my calls often were. But, it worked out. And so I did 2 months full time and 1 month where I just took call, and I was home with my son. And so I think it's about being clear on what you're doing, being incredibly organized, and not being afraid to ask. I mean, you're not hurting anybody to ask something. And I'm grateful to many, many people, and I try to pay it forward. So, for example, I have a National Science Foundation research experience for undergraduates program. Because I was so fortunate to be able to do research as an undergrad, I want other people to. So it's just that kind of thing. I also am very, very flexible with working mothers, and I do everything I can, more even working fathers, so that they can be with their children. So it's all about balance. It's about asking, being cognizant of the privileges you're given that are unusual from other people, and trying to impact the system as little as possible. Don't expect anything, just ask. And then helping others so that their role can be a little bit easier the next go round.
Thank you so much, Dr. Winston. One of the remarkable things that you've done in your career has been coming up with new driver training techniques and also recognizing the suboptimal restraint for children in motor vehicles. Now, when I was looking through your body of work, there were hundreds of publications and tens of patents that I saw. How do you decide that you're going to patent it versus you're going to write a paper?
This is one of the key things with my research. So I call it research to action to impact. So identify issues, study them in depth, develop interventions and test them, Once it works, then it's implementation science to get it out there and then measure impact. Okay? So really, again, I keep saying the same thing. My goal is not to get promoted. My goal was always to solve problems and to improve lives. Okay? So one of the ways you improve lives is actually commercialization and getting things out there to getting it into the hands of the people who can affect change, right? So I always had that as a dissemination path. It's either like my work is supposed to help new programs, new policies, new clinical practice, new devices, new regulations. All those paths are open to how you can improve lives, right? And so with that said, you can't be closed to this one path just because it's commercialization. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as you are sure that you're still remaining rigorous. And so I just, Penn has a wonderful conflicts policy. I have a conflict management plan that I just wrote for a spin-out company that we're doing. I didn't write it. It was written for me. And so commercialization is one path. Writing papers is a portion of a path. But I'll be honest with you, it's a pretty limited path. Just because you've published something in JAMA does not mean it will make any difference in the world. And I learned that very early on because I've been lucky enough to have several papers in top-tier journals. And just because you've published it, what's the difference? So you get promoted, right? But I see that as the beginning of dissemination. It's a wonderful way to actually start to galvanize what are we going to do with this finding. And so we actually have, in all these sectors, we have wonderful people who are out there making differences every day, who look to our research to guide their efforts, whatever they might be. So we have automobile manufacturers who are looking to how to make cars safer for children and teens. We have clinicians who are looking at how to deal with trauma-informed care, how to deal with concussion, all these kinds of things. So they're looking for our information. Or policymakers. Many of the laws in the country were fueled by our research. Regulators in the federal government, many of the regulations are fueled by our research. That's what I call action-oriented research. Doesn't mean that if I have to go back in the lab to figure something out, I'll do it, okay? But that's not because that's what my job is. I see my job as a physician scientist to make a difference. And so the way I make a difference is through partnership and through boundary spanning.
I think that's a very amazing way of thinking. So thank you so much. Now, along those lines, you also co-founded a company last year called Diagnostic Driving. So what was that experience like?
I started really a large line of research to try to understand young drivers, and I found out that skill and inexperience were at the core. They didn't know how to drive, okay? They were getting on the road not knowing how to drive. So I backed up from there, and we have many things we did related to that. But one of the things I said is, so what's the gate? What is the one step between not being a driver and being a driver? It's your license, right?
Right.
So what is the test we currently have for licensure?
Well, there's a written test, and then you go parallel park and drive on the road for 5 minutes.
Yeah. So we wonder why we're putting people on the road who don't know how to drive, right? But we really went down this path of figuring out what were the most common crash scenarios and what were the metrics that were associated with whether or not someone would crash in those scenarios, right? So we very systematically looked at federal databases, distilled it down, and put it into a 5 to 20 minute drive, right? Well, I could not figure out how to disseminate that. I couldn't figure it out because all my other work, like when I found airbag injuries in kids and what that mechanism was, I could work with the airbag manufacturers, the auto industry. When it was related to booster seats, I could work with the child restraint manufacturers. I mean, I had my dissemination partner, but when it came to simulated driving assessment, there was no partner. I couldn't figure out how else to disseminate this, how else to affect it. So that's where we went that path.
Now, with limited funding available, a lot of scientists see a difficult future, and they are often worried about what will happen to the next grant that they write. And I believe traffic injury prevention is not an area of science that is ever on the radar for top funding priorities. So when you even start thinking about tackling a problem like that, I imagine one of the initial concerns you would have is how do you go about testing ideas, which, at least initially, would require some resources to test out and then demonstrate that this is something worth investing more into. So, was that ever a concern? How did you tackle those scenarios?
Again, I was very fortunate, but I'll tell you something that is that when all my trainees, I help them understand with funding, whether it's in injury or elsewhere, there are 3 R's and an I. Relationships, relevance, rigorous research, and importance will get you funding, hands down, from anybody. It doesn't matter who it is. And we forget that it has to be relevant. So you may think you have the greatest idea, but it needs to be relevant to the funder. You need to think about what's the right funding mechanism. It ended up that the National Science Foundation was a much better fit for me than the National Institutes of Health. It's fine. Okay? I am an engineer. That was okay. I've done very well with the National Science Foundation. So that's about relevance. Relationships are really important. It's about knowing who's out there, what are people interested in. I get the best ideas from sometimes talking over my ideas with somebody who's out there actually in the field. And so those relationships are really important. You always have to propose the best science. Don't ever scrimp on that. Never. You manage expectations, under promise, over deliver, get the right scope of work for the right budget. If you have a little project, little scope of work, okay? And then if it's important, it's going to get funded. I've never had a problem with that. I mean, I just have to say, it was really, I was worried about it a lot early on. And I was really upset that all these kids were dying and no one was funding injury research. But then I actually have people who fund it. They're from diverse funding sources. Drives our sponsored research office crazy because I'm always putting in grants that are non-traditional, but it's still funding and it's still credible. And I have plenty from the federal government as well. But it's about asking the right question.
I think that's very unique. So, guys, remember the next time you're writing a grant, the 3 R's and the I.
Right.
Well, let's wrap up this segment, Dr. Winston, with what I call our rapid fire round.
Okay.
So, your task next is to come up with a one word or a one phrase response to the set of questions I ask you without giving it a second thought.
Okay.
So, are you ready?
Probably not, but I'll try.
So, what's the number one misconception people have about driving?
That having a license means that you're an experienced driver and that you know what you're doing.
Where do you see the field of injury prevention and research 10 years from now?
Much more personalized, just like personalized medicine.
What's the hardest thing about being a parent but also a pediatrician?
Time.
What's the most unpleasant remark you've ever heard in a workplace setting directed against women physician scientists?
Here's where the wives should be. A computer science professor at a National Science Foundation meeting, he wanted to keep talking to one of my colleagues, and he told me that I should go over and be with the wives because he thought I was the guy's wife rather than a professor. I don't mind being a wife. I love being a wife, but I wasn't in that setting.
One scientific article or even a non-scientific article that you'd recommend to any medical or college student?
Can it be a book?
It can be.
Okay. To engineer is human.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Winston. This was incredibly fun.
Okay. Thank you.
So, I hope you guys enjoyed this segment. Now remember, as Benjamin Franklin had once said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. A profound statement that clearly still is true today. Because injuries to children ages 10 and under result in a direct medical expenditure of more than $5 billion. Human-centered design is changing millions of lives all over the world, and public health strategies designed with the end user in mind can not only reduce injuries but also be tremendously cost effective. I hope you enjoyed this segment. Stay tuned for our next one. Until then, thanks for watching.